Xiaochun, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure. So the actually the idea is to have a research group and that will bring people together. So we realize that actually within the university, in different disciplines and in different schools, we all have colleagues who are working on video games or game related research, but we don't actually get know each other. And then this research group is to sort of have a network or platform we hope to enhance the dialogue between different disciplines to exchange ideas and also research method, different perspectives and approaches. So yeah, maybe we go to the next slide.
Yes, our sort of interests, I suppose, broadly sort of work across four areas, which is, as we sort of already touched on, networking, primarily both within the university and without, across academia, across industry, partnerships that we're hoping to build as a result of that, the research that we're hoping to undertake and support, and then the sort of innovation we hope that might come out of this initiative. So to start with, I'll take this one. The networking aspect is kind of at the heart, as we've been sort of briefly in our overview have kind of been touching on, to hopefully build a cross-disciplinary network of researchers and industry professionals working in gaming and XR. We're sort of defining gaming very broadly because we accept that there's a lot of crossover between what's happening in the world of AR and VR, but also sort of our primary interest is in sort of digital games, very broadly defined. We want to sort of work with early career researchers all the way up to professors and creative directors in industry. I myself am an early career researcher. So the network hopefully will end up being both sort of local to Bristol, but also extended beyond that, so that we can have discussions with colleagues who are already doing excellent work in this sort of field in other universities and beyond. And our aim is to sort of create brokerage events and theme meetings. We already have a strong interest in sort of translation and audiovisual enhancement as that sort of come out of some early meetings. We've got a lot of strong interest in history and games, as well as the legal side of things. So we're hoping to sort of build on those existing themes, cross-cutting themes, to sort of bring scholars and practitioners together. Xiaochun, do you want to take this one?
And also for partnerships, so we do work with the industry and with colleagues from other discipline, as Richard has already mentioned. So we are hoping to also to build a bridge or a dialogue between academia and the industry. So we do hope to host in industry showcases. So if you are working in the industry, it will be great to have you here as well. And we will invite guest speakers, not only academics, but also experts from the industry and also gamers and also participants. So we can celebrate video games as a media and have fun and enjoy and have intellectually stimulating conversations.
That's really nicely put. And from those partnerships, we're hoping to kind of build sustainable collaborations, such that we have an existing project. Xiaochun will talk about her project, and I'm part of a researcher on a large project as well. And these projects have at their heart sort of a very interdisciplinary and work with industry, but we're hoping to build more of that through the lab. And we're thinking of doing that through a series of kind of research sharing events and discussions. And that will include research events led by early career scholars, because there's quite a few PhD students these days coming through working on games, as well as sort of more public facing and public engagement events. And we're also hoping to sort of build on what makes games unique, to use them as a space to explore ideas for research projects, sort of brainstorming for collaborations, and to sort of find these shared points of interest within games that are so rich and so varied in what they offer us as experiences and as pieces of media to study, to investigate, even to build from scratch and then research. So we're hoping to use the lab as a means to generate interest for future funding bids, for edited publications, even for startups, etc. The sky is the limit, hopefully.
Yeah, ultimately, we want to be innovative, and we wanted to create something new and explore collaboration and new limits. So hopefully we have new ideas and new games, hopefully, and new research topics, projects. Yeah, so coming out of this research group. So we are really excited and on the like to have brainstorming sessions to be really creative and original.
Absolutely. So with that all in mind, we thought this was a great opportunity because the lab won't be launching formally until September, and then it will run for at least 2 years. It's been funded for 2 years in the first instance, so we're using this session as a way of sort of stimulating interest in what the lab's going to do, to get your ideas potentially for what you would like to see the lab do, and for how you might like to get involved. So if you're already working on video games, XR, and you would like to get in touch to talk about how we might be able to collaborate or work together or support your work, then please get in touch with Xiaochun or myself. If you work in the games industry, we would absolutely love to hear from you and to connect. We're going to be pursuing lots of different avenues for how we can engage with the industry. But again, this is a wonderful opportunity. If there are people here already from industry that would like to talk to us, who we haven't already spoken to, please get in touch. Like I said, let us know what you would like to see the Game Lab do. We have time to plan quite an exciting program of events over the coming years, so we would really like to hear your thoughts, and to join the lab, to hear about our events. So please send us your email, send us what you're working on, send us your ideas, and we'll put that all together and then keep in touch about what we're planning to do. In terms of feedback on this and your ideas and questions, we've got a sort of Q&A session at the end, so we thought we'd save, if you could save your questions and comments to then, that would be great, because we can share some of our existing research, and hopefully that might help in turn to sort of stimulate some of the discussion that we could have near the end of the session. So without further ado, Xiaochun, would you like to take us away?
Yeah, so maybe I will start with the current research project I have been working on. So yeah, I'm based in translation studies. So I myself actually is a game translator. So I translated several video games from English into Chinese. But at the moment, I'm working on video game accessibility. It's also one of the topics that are very much to my heart. So basically, a little bit of background. So video games has become a worldwide mainstream entertainment. So there are 2.9 billion active gamers, according to the sort of latest data. Most games are actually not accessible or fully accessible for people with diverse abilities. So usually users with disabilities will face three main challenges. Sorry, next slide. When playing games. So for example, they may not be able to receive stimuli, or they can establish how to take specific actions that allow the game to move forward, or they cannot interact with the game devices that provide input. So in general, game accessibility for players with sight loss is especially challenging because we all know video games are very much visual and interactive, although there are also some audio games available. But in general, the accessibility barrier for blind and visually impaired users are quite high. And despite this, some of them are still like to play video games, and they do so by using different strategies, and they may work with their family members, or to work with friends and with help, but it kind of may reduce their gaming experience and enjoyment. So making games accessible for blind players require all the visual elements to be represented by means of auditory or haptic feedback. And audio games are games built on audio and tactic feedback with no visual elements, which are blind accessible but not mainstream. So next slide, please. And yes, so at the moment for film and TV, so we have audio description as a kind of service to describe the visual elements verbally, and audio description has been widely used in film, TV, theater, and many other cultural events, but not yet widely implemented in video games. Next slide, please. So, and yeah, against this background, we have the AD4 Games project funded by Bristol Institute from the University of Bristol. So we worked with audio describers, game developers, and visually impaired participants. And we used the game Before I Forget, developed by 2 of our partners to conduct a few experiments. And we tested ways AD can enhance game accessibility. And so a little bit about the game. So Before I Forget is an environmental narrative game. It's also known as walking simulator. So it is a type of adventure game focusing on a gradual exploration and discovery through observation and with little action. So we consider Before I Forget and also the this type of game a good start to experiment with audio description. So in this game, the player will play Sunita, who is a woman, very much alone in a house and looking for her husband, Dylan. And by exploring objects in the room, in the house, and the player gets to know the story behind Sunita's life and where to find her, to find Dylan, her husband. And the next slide, please. That's a short trailer, so we can, yeah, maybe we can have a quick look. Short, no. Yes, sorry, there should be sound, but we. Yeah, there should be sound. We seem to have some technical issues here, but you can watch it on YouTube, so it gives you a glimpse of the game we have been working on. So should we go to the next slide? So yeah, so the first step of the project is to investigate how audio description can be applied to gameplay. So we identified 3 ways to test whether AD can be produced or can be applied in video games. So first we use the traditional way of AD for recorded gameplay video, so which is similar to the method normally used in the industry to provide audio description for film and TV. So one of the academics played the game and recorded the gameplay, and one of the audio describers wrote the script for the gameplay video with time codes and did the recording as well. And then the second type we tried is to have a live game streaming session where an audio describer describes the way a player interacts with the game. And the third type is that audio describer acting as both game streamer and the audio describer. So she played the game while describing what's going on in the game. So we all of these 3 videos are available on YouTube. If you search AD4 Games, you will find them. So we also invited blind and visually impaired viewers to fill in an online open survey and to give us feedback. So we also had discussion with the audio describers and reflecting the process and the challenges, and maybe in summary, so in terms of script-based or live AD, the pros and cons we are sort of debated, and in short, I think actually one of the participants summarized it very well. So script-based description, which is the recorded AD, wouldn't allow for community interactions, but would provide a tighter and a more cinematic gaming experience, since all the right words would be used and convey exactly what's happening, as opposite to live description, where the describer may not be able to think of the right word, forcing them to improvise, but there is like interaction and to have this sense of co-playing. So yeah, so there are pros and cons. And the interaction between the audio describer and the visually impaired players is was then experimented with the second stage of the project, which is AD-assisted game playing. So we invited 2 participants to play the game with 2 audio describers who described visual elements in the game to them live based on their actions in the game. So the audio description was very personalized, and then there were loads of dialogue between the describer and the player. So with all the information, all the data collected from the 3 experiments, so we have been working together with the game developer and explore possible ways of implementing audio description in this game. So we have added audio cues and AD and created a tutorial room to help the player engage with the accessibility feature. So if you are interested, we are here on site, and then you're welcome to come and play the current accessible version on my computer. So overall, we took a user-centered design approach in this project, and so user-centered design is a design philosophy that puts user of a product or application or experience at the center of the design process. So we invited end users to join the projects and provide feedback on the 3 AD experiments, and build on the data collected. We implemented the product and we tested the game and feedback to the game developer. So it's like an ongoing process of testing, improving, testing, and improve the game again. So next, please. So what's next? So this current project will be has already ended, but it has been further funded by Bristol. So we will have 84 games follow-on projects, and we will explore whether there are other ways that AD can improve game accessibility. So we will probably focus more on interactive, the AD or like co-playing experience. And it is also another question to ask is, what is the best way to make audio described games available in a different language and a culture? So with that, I got funding from the British Academy to explore whether the audio description we created can be translated, or it is better to have the audio description made or produced from scratch. And we will also test with game players and to see what they think about the gaming experience, and hopefully we will further improve game accessibility. I think that's all from me, and yeah, so we will take questions at the very end. So I will hand over to Richard.
Thank you, Xiaochun, for that wonderful overview of your work in this area. I'll give a similarly brief kind of snapshot of what I'm working on. So when I thought about this seminar, I thought mostly around kind of how I work with data in the different projects that I'm working on. So in my role as a research associate in ancient Greek history and virtual reality, I work on this very exciting project called the Virtual Reality Oracle, where we've been building a virtual reality simulation of visiting the ancient Greek oracle of Dodona in the mid-5th century BCE. And this oracle is really interesting because we've got sort of evidence for how the questions that people asked of the oracle of Zeus at this sanctuary. So we can start to reconstruct what it might have been like for pilgrims to be there, to ask the questions that they asked, to have the experience of an oracular consultation. And this project was really interesting because it was led by ancient historians at the University of Bristol, along with computer scientists, neuroscientists, and psychologists. And we were working with a games company to build this simulation from the ground up So my role on the project was really to think about what kind of historical data we have for this sanctuary, this site, the ritual process, all of which is quite contested, quite fragmented. We don't know a lot of things that it would be nice to know. So the process of putting this together was a process of sifting through historical data, the questions that people asked, the types of material culture there would be at this sanctuary. So in this picture here, you can see tiny statues of Zeus there that have been reconstructed digitally here based on the types of evidence, material evidence that we have for the site. Same with the sort of pottery that you can see here. The tree behind the priestess here is a very old oak that was known to be at the sanctuary. Research has been undertaken to determine what kind of oak it was, so we could sort of narrow down the type of tree, its possible age, how it might have been pollarded or not. Because the tree was central to the process of the ritual in some shape or form, whether Zeus spoke through the tree, whether the priestess interpreted the sounds of the tree, whether there were doves involved. There's lots of outstanding questions, but through sifting through that material evidence, that literary evidence, we could start to reconstruct the space, what this sanctuary looked like in the period where it was very unbuilt up, where it was very naturalized. And we could think about the role that priestesses might have had in the process, how they communicated with the gods in this case, and how they communicated the answers to pilgrims that came here with their questions. And on the back of the tree itself, you can see here little lead tablets. This is what pilgrims wrote their questions down on. We're not sure exactly at what point they wrote them down on, but they clearly did write them down and left them in the sanctuary, probably as dedications to the gods. So they're here on the tree as an example of the sort of really unique nature of this ritual space. So yeah, it was really interesting to work on a project where we were thinking through the evidence in order to reconstruct an approximation of an experience. We're not claiming here this is exactly what happened. This isn't necessarily a very gamified version of the ritual. It's quite cinematographic. It sort of works more like a documentary experience as you go through it. And again, we'll be showing this VR simulation in person during the in-person workshop straight after this at Bristol, if anyone would like to come and see it. And it will be launching formally early next year for people to be able to access more freely at home. But it's been a really exciting project to work on from a sort of data angle in order to ascertain, what should go into a simulation, how you work with industry to sort of conceive of a new space in order to then work out what kind of impact this experience might have on audiences. The next stage of the project is to assess whether this can be used as a teaching tool in schools for where Dodona is a topic for study. So that's the current research project I'm on. I also have a separate research strand and interest that is very much in sort of gaming, and in particular historical gaming, as it relates to the ancient world in particular. And some of my primary interests here is less on the world building aspect that I was just talking about, and actually more on the user aspect, the audience feedback. And there's two angles here that I just want to talk about briefly. One is the fact that gaming companies themselves are gathering huge quantities of data on player experiences of their games, and then presenting that data. It's sort of just in kind of, in this case, Ubisoft that worked on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they released a sort of year in review of the game. And they were able to present data gathered from all the users and what they'd done in that game over a year, which is a really interesting collection of data, because you get a rich sense of what people are using these spaces for. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a game set in ancient Greece. It's sort of set around the time of the Peloponnesian War, but as with the Assassin's Creed franchise, it's got a lot of fantasy elements in it, a lot of heavily fictionalized elements. It's a really interesting example of a historical game that sort of ramifies into mythology, into fantasy, into other parts of sort of history. So it's been really interesting to look at this data and try and ascertain what it can tell us about the experiences of players. So the first one here, you can tell that most people spend time in historical games killing things. It's a it's an interesting example, because your historical fiction, it often focuses on sort of warfare, battles and things, but games take that next step, allow you to have an active agency in that process. And so it sort of furthers the sort of general thrust of historical fiction there. But also you get some really interesting sort of breakdowns here around the dialogue choices. So again, a game could be an incredibly intimate individual experience, and I've written about games in this way where if you think very carefully and reflect on your experience, you can sort of ascertain what a game is doing. It's very different from studying a text or a film, but here you've got a very sort of interesting quantitative analysis of players' dialogue choices. So they actually are on a whole more friendly than aggressive in this game, which is interesting because the game lets you be aggressive or friendly, sort of at your own discretion. There's actually more people will be more truthful than lying, which is another interesting one, but also that they acted very much on that kind of that they embodied the idea of being a godlike figure in the game more than they did a human, and that's in the kind of the fact that the game embodies choice, in this case very very sort of centrally to its experience. So you choose how you want to experience the world, and you all the dialogue choices and options shape how you engage with it. So in this case, we can see here that actually within that first year, more players chose to act in a way that games often allow players to act, which is to have that kind of oversight that a god might have, rather than sort of be more of a human figure within that space. And also flirting was clearly very popular. On the right, we can see the fact that the photo mode, which is a mode where players can choose to take photos of their experiences, was incredibly popular, and 48 million photos were taken in the first year alone. And these photos are then shared with other players in their playthroughs. So you've got this really interesting audience interaction. And the distance players traveled was enormous, as they said, more than twice enough to get to Jupiter and back 6 times. So I think that tells us a lot again about the fact that this open world, which Assassin's Creed Odyssey is an open world game, is incredibly immersive. Players spend a huge amount of time in it, and in that time they spend a lot of time exploring this world, on foot in this case, more than anything else. So again, this quantitative data can tell us a lot about what people are doing in games, especially history games, and I'm interested in picking this data apart to try and understand the impact games like this can have on ideas of history, on historical imagination, on sort of informal and formal ways of learning about the past. And another place to finally sort of wrap up that we can see some of this data in a really interesting way is on reviews. The reviews, again, for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there is something like 33,000 or more, I think, by now. Too many reviews to ever read through manually and for any player to actually go through. So these are all kind of more sharing experiences. But again, if we start to sort of drill down into some of them, you get some really interesting sort of nuggets of information about how people are experiencing historical games. So in this case, someone really enjoyed the game because they love Greek mythology, and as I said, the game ramifies between history and mythology quite often. So that was you could sort of see that playing out there in their personal experience. But I thought this one was an even richer example. As the post says, as far back as I can remember, I always knew that I wanted to be a loose cannon roaming the mean streets of ancient Greece. There's that kind of godlike experience that we saw earlier. Finally, my dreams have been made whole. I've decimated countless wrongdoers in the name of justice, scoured the earth and holy treasures while desecrating once sacred tombs and spat in the face of the gods themselves. There's a lot going on there, and you can see how games are sort of taking or adapting aspects of sort of film as they sort of the archaeological films like sort of Indiana Jones. That's definitely playing a role there. Spitting in the face of gods, there's a kind of, again, sort of pitting the player against the divine, which is quite a common theme of ancient history games, especially the mythological ones. And then there's this last bit I think is a really interesting part of the post. This game is truly beautiful, incredibly expansive, and will make you want to take up learning Greek. Now it's there, it's the sort of shift from this really immersive experience that's very sort of combative, it's very typical in a gamified way of playing with the past. It's that sort of thing we saw at the start. How many, the greatest statistic is how many other things players have killed in this world. But then I love at the end it says, and I'm going to take up learning Greek. I mean, but it shows the impact that these games can kind of have. And in some ways, learning about Greek, or that move towards saying they want to learn about Greek, is an interesting one, because a lot of what goes into building games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, as I said about the VR Oracle, is in it sort of an understanding of what this world represents. And in ancient epic and ancient tragedy, there is a lot about facing the gods, understanding how humans interact with the divine. And so you can sort of see how there's an interesting overlap here between a kind of informal education and an attempt to sort of think about how you might go on and have a sort of formal education as a result of learning from a game. And again, here, this is just an interesting example of how many hours people can spend in games these days, which again helps us sort of quantitatively to understand immersion. And finally, just to wrap up, I wanted to say most of my next area that I want to look into is sort of trying to understand these reviews more broadly than just going into individual ones and sort of picking them apart, but to see how experience is perhaps more shared, a bit like that sort of data that was gathered of people playing the game. So to do that, I'm sort of looking at massive surveys that were undertaken, like the value survey of 1,600 participants. And from the raw data of that, you can see that 92% of people responded yes to the question, has a video game motivated or inspired you to learn more about a historical person or event? And this is interesting because it quantifies what has been very common and really central to the experience of historical fiction from the outset, where historical novelists from sort of Sir Walter Scott onwards would say you should read historical fiction in order to get interested about history. So that idea has been there for hundreds of years in this sort of in this space in historical fiction. But games and data, we can actually start to quantify whether people actually go on and do that, and then how they go on and do that. So that's the next stage of what I've been working on. But that's enough about history and games. I'll pass on to Harn now to talk about law.
Thanks, Richard. So one of the main project I'm currently working on that relates to video games is about the copyright challenges around preserving and exhibiting video games. I'm working on this with colleagues from Queen Mary University of London, Bath Spa University, and the National Video Game Museum in Sheffield. Next slide, please, Richard. So why this project? Well, first of all, video games are an important part of our cultural heritage. Usually when I give this presentation, I spend at least 5 minutes presenting evidence on why video games are important. But I think since this is an audience that has signed up to this seminar, I can dispense with that and talk about the rest of it. So there's evidence now that more and more cultural heritage institutions are interested in collecting, curating, and exhibiting video games. And these range from specialist institutions like, as I said, the National Video Game Museum, and to generalist institutions like the Victoria and Albert and the Science Museum, which have held exhibitions about and on video games. The video game industry itself recognizes the importance of video game preservation. The International Game Developers Association has a special interest group on game preservation, and they have published a paper saying how urgent this task is. And it is urgent, and especially the case for older games, because of two related factors. The first is bit rot, which is a snappy way of saying that basically the physical media on which video games are stored, they decay and they erode and they become unusable. This is especially bad for magnetic forms of storage, but it also includes digital forms of storage. And the other problem is technological obsolescence, which means that given the rapid pace of technological change, older games can now no longer be played on contemporary software and hardware platforms. So if we want to be able to for ourselves and also for future generations, if we want to let people like us and also future generations be able to play older games, we need to find some way of preserving them and giving access to them. All the research indicates that one of the most serious and ongoing practical challenges to video game preservation is copyright law. And in the next slide, I will explain why. Okay, so there are a number of things that a museum or a cultural heritage institution of this kind might want to do in terms of exhibiting the video games in its collection. First of all, it might simply take the medium, like this cartridge here of one of the Pokemon games, and put it out on display for people to look at. Now, this is fine for copyright purposes. This is because in the UK, the only protected work here would be the art, and there's no restricted public display right for works of art. So the museum will be fine doing this. They get into trouble, or at least potential trouble, they try to do absolutely anything else. Next, please, Richard. So let's say they want to take it a step up. They have a copy of a game. They want to let visitors to the museum play the game. This seems like a simple thing, but it isn't. One of the reasons why is because copyright law is extremely expansive. and extremely rigid. So computers are essentially copying machines. They work by making multiple copies of whatever you want them to do. So when you play a game and you load up a game, what happens is that temporary copies of the game get made in the computer's temporary memory and on the computer screen. Now, this is going to sound a bit mad, but copyright law, under copyright law, it is clear that all of these are copies that could potentially be infringing if you make them without the right holder's permission. So you play a game without permission, you would be infringing. Normally, when you buy a game, you have this permission in the form of the end user license agreement. So you would be safe playing the game for your own personal, private, recreational purposes. But crucially, those licenses don't normally extend to allowing other people, visitors to your large cultural heritage institution to experience the game. So museums could get into trouble just by letting people play a game which they own a copy of. Next, please, Richard. It gets even more complicated if the museum wants to do anything fun, like, for instance, maybe record a short gameplay video of a difficult to reach Donkey Kong level and put it up on the internet for people to look at. This is because that also involves multiple acts of copying, multiple acts of potentially adapting the game, and also communicating the game to the public, which obviously are all acts that are prohibited under copyright law if done without the right holder's permission again. So life gets very complicated if you are a museum and you're interested in games and you want to be able to show games to people. Next, please, Richard. So the solutions that are currently available are very limited. The first one is licensing, which is basically for the institution to seek permission from the relevant right holder to do various exhibition and preservation activities to a game. This is in principle possible. The museum could write to the people who own the rights in Donkey Kong, not quite sure who they are at this point, and say, well, we would like to do these things with your game. Is that okay? First of all, the company can say no, it is well within their rights to do that. I think it would be not nice of them to do that, but they can. So at the moment, but even if they wanted to give permission, there are still complications. So at the moment, there are no standard licensing agreements between the cultural heritage sector and the video game industry to cover these activities. And that means that anytime a museum wants to do this kind of activity, it has to negotiate a license from scratch. And this is very expensive and very time consuming. Another problem is that it may not be possible in practice to identify or contact the relevant right holders. Part of the problem is that the video game industry is very volatile. Studios are born, make a huge hit, and then disappear or are liquidated in a very short span of time. So sometimes, even with games that are only a couple of decades old, it might be impossible to work out who owns the rights to them. So you can't even contact the right holder to get permission. Next, please, Richard. So a case in point is No One Lives Forever, a game that was arguably too sophisticated for its time. And a studio called Night Dive has been trying to make it available for sale, but they can't work out who owns the rights. And nobody has said, well, we own the rights, so we can give you permission. But everyone, all the companies who might have the rights have said, if we find out that we own the rights and we see you distributing this without our permission, you will get into trouble. So the game is stuck in limbo. Kate Archer, when will I see you again? Next, please, Richard. Yes, the other possibility in terms of solutions are exceptions and limitations, also known as defenses. Now, we all know that copyright law, although strict, does have some provisions to allow uses that are socially desirable. But the one that we'll all be familiar with is specific provisions to allow educational uses of works. However, when it comes to preservation and exhibition activities, these are very limited and overly specific. At the moment, under copyright law, cultural heritage institutions can only make preservation copies of items that are in their permanent collections, and only where the purchase of a replacement is not reasonably practicable. So this is obviously very limited. It does not give permission to carry out exhibition activities. It basically only allows you to make a duplicate for the purposes of storage, essentially. It also doesn't allow the institutions to make use of items from other institutions' collections, or not that I'm condoning piracy, but copies that have been preserved by player communities. And next, please, Richard. Next, please. Sorry, slide before that. So at the moment, the aims of the project are first to identify the full range of preservation and exhibition activities, and then to identify their copyright implications. And then next so this is essentially a mapping exercise, so a practical mapping exercise. The next part is a legal mapping exercise. We assess the extent to which these activities are permitted by current copyright law. And we suspect the answer is going to be they are permitted only to a very, very small degree. So the next step is to create solutions. And we have two sets of solutions. So the first one is to develop a template licensing agreement together with a guidance toolkit. This is so that right holders who want to license to cultural heritage institutions can have a standard format to use rather than having to incur the costs of licensing from scratch. And then the second thing is to draft and propose legal reforms to better accommodate video game preservation and exhibition activities. And then this will be the hard one, to persuade international copyright organizations and regional and national copyright organizations to also push for these reforms so that they can actually be implemented at some point in the future. Next, please, Richard. So that was a very brief overview of this current project, and I would welcome any questions or any feedback that you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Harn. We're running slightly over time. I'm going to have a look at the questions in the chat. Does anyone want to jump in the meantime with any questions they might have?
I see there's a question for me. Yes, so definitely AI to dynamically and automatically generated AD. I think there's a research team in University of York who's working on that, but it's definitely a fascinating area, I think. Yeah, maybe after I finish the current two projects, I would very much like to explore more on that. I think this could be it could be the next solution for the future. And the question about XR, I think XR refers to experience.
It's a kind of, it is a catch-all term for VR, AR, MR, mixed reality, extended reality. It's it tries to sort of capture all those immersive technologies.
There's a question on copyright and esports. Should I go ahead and answer that? So how is copyright handled in esports with regard to live audiences and online or televised relay? So all of those activities are captured by copyright. So I imagine there would be a complicated series of agreements and licenses between the right holders, between the organizers, between the players, and potentially also the audience might have to agree on to certain things in order to participate.
I can see there's a question from Ono. Yep, we will have a mailing list. So if you could send us your email, we can add you to that. I'll pop my email in the chat. If anyone would like to join the lab and hear about what we're going to get up to, then please email us for an informal chat for to sign up, or however you would like to get involved. Please email Xiaochun or myself or both of us.
Yeah.
We would be very happy to talk to anyone who's interested in this. It's an exciting new initiative, and we're hoping it'll bring lots of people together.
Yeah, definitely. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. And there will be a mailing list, so we will add you to the mailing list. So you will hear from us about our forthcoming activities and events.
And I think because we're running slightly behind, Giuseppe, you've got your hand up. Do you have a quick question you wanted to ask before I hand over to Hen to wrap up?
Yeah, it was a bit maybe more generic question, but it's a bit for all of you experts on video games, and it's about what extent do you think video games, affect people into the reality, and in a good and in a bad way. For instance, if we look at a flight simulation, the video game there. Well, many people are used for good purposes, obviously to train themselves. But as you remember, the terrorist attack in New York on 9/11. I mean, those terrorists, they train themselves with the video game. So I would like to know, I mean, how even the jurisdiction or the acts in this way when video games can train, so to speak, I mean, people with bad intentions. So how do you see this affection in between, humans and video games? Yeah, it's a bit generic question. I'm quite into it about that.
It's a fantastic question. I don't think we have time to answer it in any way near comprehensively because it is such a good question. I mean, just from my research, I can say that games clearly have an impact in trying to trace that, understand that, and the ethics behind that is crucial. And I think it's going to be a big and expanding field.
Great, thank you so much to the speakers. Such an interesting presentation in such an important area and such a diverse range of ideas and presentations. So really appreciate that, and for everybody who's come to this event which has been run by the Jean Golding Institute. So there's some stuff in the chat there about how you can stay in touch, get to the rest of the program, maybe come to the wrap-up event at the Watershed at 3. On Friday. But meanwhile, thank you so much, presenters, and we look forward to seeing where this goes to, hoping it's the beginning of great new collaborations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. And thanks to the Jean Golding Institute for hosting us today.